Welcome to the Embodiment podcast. This show is for you if you see the body as more than a brain taxi. It's for people interested in coming home to the body as a holistic aspect of who we are and how we live. Episodes contain practical tips, exercises you can take away, and interviews with embodiment specialists from around the world. I'm your host, Mark Walsh. So on the show today, Martin Aylward. So Martin is a very experienced meditation teacher. He runs a wonderful retreat centre in the south of France called the Moulin de Chartres, I believe it's pronounced. He's well known for his work, sex, money, dharma talks and workshops. So really taking a more in-life approach to Buddhism and meditation, which is how I first heard of him some years ago, because it was like, oh, okay, this guy's, not just meditating in caves in the Himalayas, which is also done, but really very much in the world as someone who's a father, runs a center and does a lot of online training, co-founder of the Mindfulness Training Institute, I'm visiting faculty on MSc in mindfulness-based interventions. So yeah, also just an old mate of mine. So Martin, it's nice to see you.
Nice to see you. Yeah, hi.
So how did you get interested in the body? What was your journey into this?
How did I get interested in the body? I think I was a bit of a slow learner, actually, because I was much more interested in mind, but mostly from the kind of existential angst and confusion of my own mind as a teenager, really.
Yeah.
And, it was a mix, I would say, half confusion and angst, and oh my God, what a messy mind. And the other half was this sort of wonder of, wow, what is it to be human? What is it to be conscious? And sort of really struck by the mystery of that and the potency. And going off to India and, spending time in monasteries and ashrams and retreat centers and hermitages and, very much sort of plunging very wholeheartedly into meditation practice, but very much as mind training. And, I think that's the way most people think of meditation, right? Is as a kind of mental exercise, a mental training, a mental exploration. And, it took me, even though the foundation of meditation practice in the Buddhist tradition, and Buddha points to this very much, the first foundation is mindfulness of bodily experience. But the mind bit, and even that word mindfulness, right? So we use mindfulness. It's a really inaccurate, firstly, it's a really inaccurate translation. And secondly, it emphasizes this mental aspect. And we could very well equally call it bodyfulness, right? Because actually what one's being encouraged to do is settle into one's experience and kind of land in one's experience, to kind of call one's attention back into one's experience. And so after, some years of really trying to just train my mind at the expense, really, of body, some attempt to get up and out of the messiness of bodily life or worldly life, kind of, everyday life, then my interest started to go the other way. And I really, that sense of actually awakening is a visceral process. Awakening happens here. But there's this beautiful line of the Buddhas, right? The whole universe rises and passes right here in this body. And so that sense then of actually not making a distinction between mind training, we could say, and embodiment training or awareness, and a much more, sense of here being where the interest is, here being where the attention is, here being where the experience is, and then here being where the awakening is. And that being a very visceral sense of here.
Yeah. So this word mindfulness is, a slightly odd translation of sati, isn't it, in Pali, that seems to indicate this sort of mentalness, which, if we look at, say, the four foundations of mindfulness, like classic sort of Buddhist texts, which is looking at this, the very first one, as you said, is, okay, body, let's start there. And when people are paying attention to breath, for example, well, that's also body, right? Like kind of classic kind of Buddhist objects of meditation. So there is this kind of strong Buddhist tradition of paying attention as a sort of anchor, the body as an anchor to the present moment. And then there are also slightly sort of anti-body threads in a lot of Buddhism as well, right? Like kind of hyper-intellectual, or kind of the body as sort of shit or dirt is kind of, various passages I've come across around that as well.
Yeah, I don't think there's I don't see, you might see that in contemporary versions of Buddhist thinking. I don't see the hyper-intellectual bit in the tradition, but there's definitely there's practices that are really designed to generate disgust, right, with the body. I think there's really misunderstood, and they're often actually unhelpful in a contemporary setting where people anyway have a very ambivalent relationship with. There's a lot of self-hatred and a lot of rejection of body. And so disgust can sound rather, alarming or strange, but actually it's, so one of the aspects of that first foundation, looking at body, is to kind of the contemplation of body as nails, hair, shit, piss, blood, phlegm, bile, and it's not to generate rejection or dislike. It's rather to recognize, oh, this that I get so fixated on, this that I get so busy with obsessing about how it looks and all the rest of it, it's actually like it's a bunch of natural processes. It's like hair does its thing. It grows by itself. It grays by itself. It falls out by itself. Breath breathes and heart pumps and blood flows, and it's a kind of actually a way of sort of softening one's neurotic attempt to control, to be in charge of, to manage, to organize, to kind of live in the conceit of I am the owner and controller of this body, rather than being able to kind of soften into and allow body to have its natural intelligence, its natural orderliness, its natural unfolding.
Yeah, and just for listeners, you're using conceit in the kind of Buddhist sense there, right? I mean, that's a sort of very old English way of using the word.
Right. Yeah, just landed in the kind of rigid identification.
Yeah,
that's the way.
The conceit is in misunderstanding, not as in conceited, right?
Well, no, actually, I mean, in the sense of conceited. Actually, I mean, just from a Buddhist point of view, just the tendency to believe that this is who I am—that's a conceit.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, I'm just sort of saying it does seem to be that word is used quite differently by Buddhists than by non-Buddhists. This has been my experience. It's a much harsher word for other people I've seen. And this idea of, I can imagine those kind of meditations could be quite easily misunderstood in a modern context of where this kind of body hating and body shame and this kind of disembodiment of as you say, not being helpful there. Though I have noticed disgust is a very denied emotion. I said on Facebook a couple of days ago that something disgusted me, and people really didn't let me have that emotion. Like way worse than anger, which is a slightly denied emotion for spiritual people. But I said this disgusted me, and people really were upset. They were sort of saying that I was psychologically disturbed and spiritually undeveloped because I had this emotion. You must
get that a lot, right?
Well, I get that a lot, but this was I'd never seen before the denial of disgust as an emotion. People talk a lot about the denial of anger, for example.
And hatred even more so, I would say.
I did a thread once called "What Do You Hate?" and people really found it difficult to say anything on there, I hate nothing, and it was a very interesting denial of some basic things that do come up for people.
So, it's funny because I live in France, right? So just linguistically, I think disgust, dégoûté, it literally means to lose one's taste for something. And that's the sense, like as in goûter, to taste, to déguster, to taste. So disgust, I'm in that literal sense, to lose one's taste. So actually, to generate disgust for the body in the literal linguistic sense that it's meant in the tradition is that it's like losing one's fascination with one's kind of one's obsessive compulsive need to kind of to be the owner, controller, manager of. And so it's not it's not that it leads to an opposite that's a rejection or a dismissive or a non-taking care of. It's more the relief, the relaxation of not having to be the one who's doing all this. And then body, the sense of inhabiting a body is one where one has a sense of body as this thing that's kind of graceful, that has a certain natural intelligence, natural elegance, natural economy of movement, the sense of bodily processes and body movements and bodily gestures and actions, feeling free, right? Having the taste of a freeness of activity rather than the taste and the kind of neurotic taste of me being the controller of.
you in the email you said sent to me ahead of this interview, you talked about freedom versus friction. So what did you mean by that, as if you're talking about freedom there?
Well, I would say any moment, right, has one of those two tastes to it. Either a moment has a taste of freeness, and there's a certain fluidity to it, there's an ease, and by that taste one can sense, and it's a visceral sense, that there's no contraction, there's no sense of being in conflict with. There's an allowing of mind state to be the way it is, of body to be the way it is, of world to be the way there is, and then a response to that. Yep. The response might be one where one's trying to affect a change, where one's trying to make a difference, where one has some disagreement with what's happening, etc. But even the disagreement, it has the taste of freeness running through it. And if that's not the case, and most moments aren't like that for most people, then inevitably it has the other taste. It has the taste of friction. Mm-hmm. And that's a lot of what the encouragement of, I think, of kind of inward practices. That's what the opportunity they give us to increasingly taste the freeness of experience, and meanwhile to kind of enter into the friction that we create and meet it and investigate it and explore it. And in other words, to find out moment by moment, what am I doing that's making my life, my experience, feel like it's somehow in friction with myself, in friction with others, in friction with the world, that I somehow feel unfree. So we could say the whole of the Buddhist practice in that sense is, on the one hand, a pointing towards freeness of being, and on the other hand, a willingness to meet and explore all the unfreeness or friction that we find along the way.
And you'll often hear meditation teachers talking about contraction. And in some ways, it seems like that's a metaphor. And in other ways, my experience is when I'm in that pushing away of reality, my muscles are quite literally more contracted. There's a sort of tightening of the body that goes along with that, which for me is often an indicator when I'm there's that kind of tightness there, there's that friction there, there's that lack of acceptance. And my whole system's just, my shoulders are coming up a bit, or my belly's tightening. And that's usually a kind of pretty good indicator to me that I'm not in that nice free mode at that point.
Right. Yeah, that's the indicator of some friction with life, right? And it's a much easier indicator to deal with if you're attuned to bodily or energetic contractions. Yeah. It's a much better way of getting a sense of what's going on than just trying to work with your mind, because mind will tell you all kinds of stories and give you all kinds of justifications for why you're feeling that. Look for all things to do about it, say about it, people to blame for it. And okay, that has its relevance, but to undercut that and just letting yourself feel and notice the contraction, and then maybe just noticing it is enough to allow it to soften, or sometimes it's not enough, and when it's not, then the opportunity to actually kind of enter into it, to explore it. How come I'm tight around this? What am I, resisting, or what belief do I have, or what am I pushing for, or whatever it might be.
Yeah, and I just invite listeners now to kind of feel into how they are listening to this, whatever state they're in, running around Byron Bay, or kind of, on the subway in Moscow or whatever. There's a sort of, just for me, there's wow, actually, how am I right now? And noticing that. And as you say, there's sort of two options there, isn't there? There's either stop it, just relax. And then there's also the option of really feeling into that and go, okay, what's going on here? Inquiring. And then there's sort of both really useful possibilities to have.
Yeah. And if you, sometimes it's, if you can just drop it, actually don't need to explore it very much.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
A lot of tension is when it's hasn't got a particularly strong emotional charge, for example. It's just the habit of holding ourselves in a posture. It's a habit of being slightly braced against life.
Yeah.
It's the habit, right, of taking oneself rather personally and seriously. I am a body moving around in space and interacting with other bodies. The more one notices the basic tendency of that, the more one might see, I don't actually need to do that. Just the softening, and then tasting, really being present in your cells enough to taste the way that softens, to taste the movement shift from friction to freeness. And then, like you say, in other moments, it's not enough because there's some kind of fear, or there's some emotional charge, there's some, kind of effort one's making, and then you need the exploration, the how come, the willingness to stay with the friction. It doesn't have to soften. If it doesn't soften, okay, then you get to inquire. Then you get to, how come? What do I get from doing this? What am I afraid of if I let it go, etc.
And I guess what makes it a bit more complicated, we stick with the kind of traditional view of the body in Buddhism and then move to a more Western, some of the specific Western issues, because I know it's a real specialism for you. In the traditional view, as I understand it, they actually talk about 3 bodies, not 1, right? So there's this slightly different understanding of what a body is. Could you speak a little bit to that? Because genuinely, that's always confused me slightly.
Yeah. So some of the traditions emphasize this more than others. I find it a really helpful model. I mean, there's nothing actually, it can sound a little bit esoteric, we've got 3 bodies, and then when we speak about energetic bodies or ethereal bodies, or it gets unnecessarily esoteric sounding. It's partly analogous to what you're familiar with Wilber's work, right? He talks about gross, subtle, and causal body.
Yeah, I don't buy it.
You don't buy it, did you say?
No.
Okay, well, let's see.
I want to hear your take on it. That's what I'm asking.
So, first body, the physical body, right? There's no argument with that. The boundaries are the skin boundary, the human shape. That's what we take to be my body, etc. But then we might go from that sense of body as thing, right? Body as object, etc., to just what's the experience of body, moment by moment. And especially this is a meditative process and exploration, right? So the experience of body isn't body shaped, right? When you're sitting in meditation, if you're still and attentive, the sense of body is of a field of sensation, right? Like a dance of vibration, sensation, movement. It usually feels more or less spherical, right? I've
got people to draw this quite a few times on the subjective body rather than the objective body. In anthropology, this is kind of words for this, and is it in sociology as well. And obviously, it's the foundation of embodied work is that there is a subjective body, and it's fascinating when you ask people to draw it, because what they draw is radically different than a sort of stick man or an anatomical figure. Right? I was just sitting in meditation a couple of days ago. I was like, wow, if I were to trace that now, it really wouldn't look like Mark. This big blob here, and this is totally absent, and this bit's glowing, and that subjective sense is really quite radically different. It's not just because someone might naively imagine the subjective sense of the body as just a sort of description of the objective sense. Does that make sense? And it doesn't really. Yeah.
And I've done those kind of exercises, right? When one draws on. I remember myself drawing myself, and my arms were huge, way out of proportion with the rest. And I could see it was in a time when I was busy and doing a lot of things, and it was just seeing how that represented being identified with my capacity and my doing and this, rather than actually being, it was to an extent that was out of balance, right? But that sense of subjective body is still influenced very much by the image of body and what it looks like, even if the proportions are different and the sense is different. Whereas what I'm talking about now is from the body defined by, the visual sense, the idea and image of body, that's first one, right, physical body, to what we might call the experiential body, which is from the inside. What's it like? And, you could, especially if you're sitting down, right, while you're listening to this, you might close your eyes, or you just drop your gaze, right, and you give up the idea of body and the associated sense of arms and legs, etc., and just feel the basic aliveness of being here, the dance of sensation, the rhythm of breath. And the more one settles into that, the more that starts to be a more predominant sense of what body is. And that starts to guide one's experience more than it's not in denial of the first sense, but it's actually experientially, this more kind of dynamic, fluid, spherical feeling sense of body, it's closer. It's more, well, without even saying it's more accurate, I would say it's more helpful. One gets more sense of information about what one's state, about what one's doing, about how activated or reactive one is from attending to the experiential body, than one does from living in the image and idea of the
yeah, I think people would kind of agree with this subjectively if you sort of said, well, would you rather have a shoulder that's stiff but feels fine, or a shoulder that's fine but feels stiff? You'd go for the former one, right? Because you go, okay, I don't want an unpleasant sensation there, you know, like, you know, there's things in my body that don't quite work like they used to, from, you know, my knees from 20 years of Aikido, for example, but they're not subjectively bothering me. You know, and I'm not planning on doing anything hugely athletic with them. So it doesn't matter that much that the sort of objective body's changed a bit. It's like, it's not really a big deal because I still feel vibrant. You know, I feel good. There's that innocence there. Yeah.
And to zoom it out a bit, you might just say, would you rather look good or feel good?
You know, this is a fascinating one because some people answer with their behavior, I would rather look good.
Exactly. I mean, you know, you see that culturally there's lots of pressure to choose the former, right?
Yeah.
No, you only have to think. Most people only have to think for a moment to realize that's ridiculous.
Yeah. But also, because why do you want to look good? So you can feel good. Just see what I mean?
Right.
So just going straight to feel good is a shortcut. Like, why do I want to so I get
override
like me, so I feel good, you know?
Right, but we override that constantly, right?
Yeah.
And then put it in the attempt to look good that becomes so dominant that we actually lose. We don't even know whether we feel good because the attunement's going so much towards how we're looking is.
Yeah, yeah.
So,
and there is something in Buddhist communities around sort of putting aside a little bit how you look. You know, like I feel like that could be taken too far, but in a culture that is extremely visual, you know, you don't see Buddhist monks working on their abs, for example. It's just not really relevant to their practice, you know. I think this is something healthy in letting that go a little bit, though. Yeah, maybe that can go too far too. I'm thinking of some very shabby.
The monastic version of that is a particular form where there's a very clear intention, like you shave your head, you shave your eyebrows, you wear a robe that's exactly the same as everyone else's robe, and it's very specifically designed to just simplify that area of your life. Like you not worrying about which direction to comb your hair or what to wear in the morning. Right?
Yeah, yeah.
But even lay practice is of such a different order to that. But because the monastic form is sort of the reference point for people, what you get, I think, is this uncomfortable or unclear middle ground where you've got people leading a lay life, which is a completely different way of being in the world. I have a huge respect for the monastic life, but it's not the life I'm living, right? I'm living a lay life.
Yeah, I really want to talk about this.
Where lay people are kind of suppressing or shutting down some of the exuberance, actually, of a lay life in order to somehow fit it into a pseudo-monastic kind of packaging.
So lay is in non-monastic, if people are not familiar with that.
Engaged life.
Yeah, so let's complete on the bodies and then come back to that. So we've done the sort of first two. What's the third one?
Third body is, simply put, infinite body. In other words, there's no since the body of life, there's no place where you can't find the edges of experience. So without going to rationally that doesn't make sense. You say, of course, body is an infinite, it's here, it begins and ends here. But again, experientially, when one really looks for the edges of experience, right, the here-ness we were saying earlier, everything's happening here, this body. One sense of you can't really tell where sounds end and the hearing of sounds begin in your experience. You can't tell where sights end and the seeing of sights begins. And again, it's a contemplative process. But as one settles into that sense of a kind of melting into the whole of life, or a sense of the whole of life, what we call the world or the universe, the sense of inside and outside kind of thinning out and seeming like a rather clumsy distinction. That doesn't mean one loses the capacity to make that distinction, right? It's not that one disrespects social boundaries, but one's existential boundaries just lose their rigidity. And that's the third body that's being spoken about, the infinite body, or we might say the body of life.
So is that a kind of identification with everything, that kind of oceanic sense of everything as oneself. I get at this point, I get a bit confused by the use of the word body. The first two make much more sense to me. Like, is it that sort of sense that when in that oceanic kind of experience, it's like, okay, you're me and I'm you and I'm that flower and that brick wall and all the rest of it? Is that sort of sense of one's own body is including everything?
Yeah. So there's a kind of, one can look at that in two ways, right? There's the sort of the inward dissolution of the sense of identification, the sense of nothing here, and the freeingness of that. And there's the kind of outward limitless expansion of identification to include everything.
Self and everything self.
Yeah. And the freeness of that, because that's what's being pointed to, right? These practices aren't designed to come up with a philosophical position about what the body is or how the body is or where the body ends. These are rather practices designed to move us from feeling a sense of friction with our lives, knowing the taste of freeness in our lives. And so that's where, if you're trying to define it, infinite body doesn't really make sense. But if one lives one's way into contemplating sounds and sights and imagery and all that appears in awareness, and the resulting expansiveness into all of that is liberating, that's what counts. And that's the emphasis on freeness of being rather than on some sort of philosophical position.
Mm-hmm. Lovely. I appreciate that answer. Thank you. I've asked that question to a few people, and that was one of the clearer answers I've been given. So I do appreciate that, Maya. And let's come back to the kind of lay versus monastic. So, Buddhism, mindfulness practices, and the Hindu kind of practices to some degree as well, kind of coming out of this tradition of monks going off in the forest, maybe in small groups. Originally not even having monasteries, but later on monasteries. And, that's quite different from, the money and sex workshops, for example. Those things are simplified. Like Buddhist monks don't touch money and they're celibate. So those sort of things, whereas, we're married men and, we run businesses, we're in quite a different situation. And as you say, it can get a bit messy where one tries, it's like you can't be half a gangster. You can't be half a monk. Do you know what I mean? It doesn't really work. So how have you kind of brought Buddhism or Dharma kicking and screaming into the 21st century with your sort of online sex and money courses?
Well, it's not quite the way I describe it as having brought it kicking and screaming. But I think, there was a certain frustration which was, partly my own with my own practice initially, and then seeing that playing out around me as well. With the Dharma scene and the Buddhist scene, on the one hand, kind of referencing monastic practice very much as its authority, but not living in a monastic life. Yeah. And therefore, this uncomfortable halfway, like you say, about not being half a monastic. So it's that sense of, okay, these teachings are about friction and freeness. One that just as much applies to any kind of life, ancient or contemporary, monastic or engaged, etc. And so my interest really to look at the stuff that I'm engaged in all day, right? Which is in its broad strokes, it's the same as a monk is engaged in all day. One's moving around, one's interacting with people, one's managing details. But in its specifics, the central three things of my life are pretty much the central three things that monks very specifically stop doing, right? They stop having sex, they stop dealing with money, and they stop engaging with a kind of, the work and everyday duties and responsibilities in order to do their practice. Yeah. So that's very interesting to me, right? Given those are the specific three things that a lot of my time and energy, our time and energy goes into. Yeah. And of course, the reason why those are the three specific things that monastics give up is because they're really charged, right? They take a lot of energy. So there's two ways you can engage with that. One way, this is what the monastic path is you consciously say, okay, I'm not going to do those things. I'm going to put those things aside and I'm going to free up that energy to explore meditation, etc.
And that's well worth practicing temporarily, isn't it, for lay people as well? I've got great benefit from simplifying my life in periods. And because you gave me some exercises around money to do with money, but there's also times when I've gone, okay, I'm just not going to spend any money for a few days, or I'm going to be celibate for a week or a month, and that can be that renunciate, kind of terribly unfashionable kind of Theravada concept is actually remarkably useful, but it's not a long-term life strategy.
Right. Well, I mean, it can be for some. If you become a monastic and spend your life as a monastic,
that's a tiny minority.
And it can also, it also works for extended periods of time, like when you go on a meditation retreat, right? And then you put aside those things for that time, and it's a very, very potent way of going deep into meditation practice. And I know you've done a bunch of that, right? So that's one way of dealing with these three charged areas, is you consciously put them aside.
Yeah.
But then that's not what one's doing as a layperson. And if you start to put them aside and feel like they're wrong or bad or too messy or too complicated to deal with, then you're not living a very fluid or fruitful life, right? Because it's a life we're dependent on those things in many ways.
Yeah, there's a spiritual bypass, the denial, or just being a bit of a loser. It's just like, well, I mean, no offense, but if your way out of sex and money is just not to have much of either, then you're still caught in the same game. You're just losing the game. That's just not very satisfying to me. So I don't go for that one.
Right. So then that was what gave rise to the course and the teachings and the exploration of that then was, well, if you're not going to put them aside, what's the way that you can fruitfully engage all the energy that goes into those areas? And because they're such charged areas, it turns out they're really, really great areas to bring your practice to, right? You get to see yourself in intimate relationship, in sexual relationship, right, in a different way than you do in your general social scene. The way you are about money shows you a lot about the way you are with life in general.
Can you talk a bit more about money? Because we've had quite a few sort of tantra type people on, and this in itself is interesting. This is episode 103, I think, something like that. And only one embodiment teacher has talked about money. There was a fire rhythm teacher who specializes in that. And no one else has mentioned it more than in passing. So can you say a little bit about some of those kind of money patterns that get exposed? Because I know you've done a lot of work on this, and I value your stuff on this.
Yeah, sure. And it doesn't altogether surprise me that it hasn't been mentioned much. What I found, first surprisingly, and then just consistently with those three things. Work, okay, everybody knows what they've got issues around work, and they're more than happy to talk about them. They're more than happy to complain about their boss or talk about the complexities of work, etc. And then you get to sex. Everyone knows they've got issues about sex, but they're not so free to talk about them, especially
I'd talk about it with you, but maybe not while the podcast was being recorded. Do you know what I mean?
And then money, you get to money, people don't even know they've got issues around money. Or they think the only issues they've got is, they haven't quite got enough. And
everyone wants 20% more. Other than that, then.
Right. And what people actually get to see is that the way they relate to money relates a lot to confidence. Is a big thing that I notice. How they relate to money shows people a lot about how confident they are in their capacity to meet life in general. So it's a little bit of an oversimplification, but we might say, how you meet money is how you meet life, right? And so for some people, the orientation is, I need, I don't have enough, I need. Yeah. And you can see that playing out in all other kinds of life.
Yeah.
For other people, there's a sense of, it's complicated, I wish I didn't have to deal with it. Right? Yeah. And then you can see that playing out in all kinds of other areas of life. And for some people, regardless of whether they earn a little or more or quite a lot, there's a sense of a kind of a fluidity with it, like a capacity to live within my means, a certain confidence that, okay, if I'm not living with my means and I feel like I need more, then I can turn my attention in this or that direction and do something about that, etc.
Yeah, I think it's a trust. It's almost like self-trust, but it's almost like a sort of having healed a kind of traumatic relationship with life, that there's a sort of trust in life. And I don't mean naively, that's another money shadow, right? Like, someone else will take care of me, I can think about spiritual things. But for example, I have to have this trust that I can make money based on the fact that I have for, running business for 10 years. And at a certain point I got that. I went, oh, look, you haven't been broke for a while. If you run out of money, you can just generate more because you seem to be okay at that. And, not everything you do turns to gold, but you seem to do okay. And I kind of relaxed. And it was like, in the same way as I see people relax when they feel like there's enough love, you know. And if I had this about food as well. I always used to be slightly scarce around food for various reasons in my upbringing. And then I did a fast for a few days, and I just realized, you know what? It's not the end of the world if there isn't food for a few days. And I think that's the renunciate path, is it frees you by showing you don't need it. Like, it's good to live in poverty at some point and go, well, I can still be happy. And then for me, there was that, like, learning to trust that I could be, I hate the word abundant because it sounds so Californian, but it was like, okay, I can generate money, I can manage money. You know, I have people to say sort of, you know, it's like when you get a group of people to say money is my friend or I like money, people are like choking and just having these strong physical reactions to that.
Yeah.
I mean, what do you do to help people with this? Like, what are some of your sort of money mindfulness exercises?
Well, there's a whole bunch of things, but mostly it's just introducing people to the territory of that. And like you say, abundance is the kind of like, seems like a barely pronounceable word these days. But actually, a lot of the words that we associate purely with, in financial terms, prosperity, wealth, right? There's actually something beautiful about those terms. But there's often a sense of either just kind of graspy neediness around them, or rejection and distaste around them. Like you say, especially for spiritual types, I like money, I want to make more money. It's like, oh!
Yeah, I just said, once I just said in a workshop, oh, I like money, you know, I like having money. And, you know, some people were angry, some people, you could see I'd gone down in their estimation. And I was like, guys, I'm not a monk. Like, what's the problem? You know, this mentality that if I have some money, you will have less. Like, it's like, if I have some love, you will have less. Like, if you applied that same scarcity mentality to love, we'd see immediately how pathological it was. Like, if someone had that same grasping quality or denying quality around it. And then there's the spiritual bypass, isn't there, of like, I'm above this.
Right.
So what do we do? Someone's out there, they're listening, they go, you know what? I'm listening to Martin and Mark. I feel like I might be a bit fucked up around money. I've got some awareness around that. What do they do?
So one thing basic, general thing, you pay attention to your relationship with it. You pay attention to what you do with it. And then more specifically, for example, you know, you track yourself through a day. What do you spend money on, and how do you spend money? You know, in a way, it's this amazing thing, money, that we're participating in this vast, complex network of mutual support, right? And we've got this, you know, token called money, and we say, oh, I want some of that, and will you give it to me? And we hand over the money. Right? And you can, you know, it can be very beautiful to pay for something with that recognition, right? Oh, you know, I walk into a shop and here's something that I could never have produced myself, etc. It's come around the world or whatever. And here's somebody who's spending their day making this stuff available to me. Well, amazing. And then here you go, thank you very much. And you offer
this cultural stuff in this. I remember saying to Rush, sorry, there's a bit of a delay. Complete what you're saying.
Well, but often, you know, that's not how we are with money. Often there's a resentful, why do I have to pay for this? Or I really want it, but I shouldn't, and it's so expensive. And, you know, sometimes I hear the pain and the bile with which people talk about, you know, things are so expensive. It's like, ow. And of course, you know, it may be that some things are beyond your means. But then what can you do? You can adjust your means, and then you don't need to feel resentful, right? Or you can adjust your needs so you don't need to feel resentful. Yeah. And by exploring just in that kind of way, right? Exploring for a day or two, what do I spend money on, and how? What's the attitude with which I spend it? You can start to notice in such a way that you can lean in to that different way of being, where it doesn't so much make a difference whether you're earning less or more or much more, but your capacity to feel a sense of enoughness, of prosperity, of kind of feeling grateful and kind of like well in the midst of that. I lived for about 15 years, the first 15 years of my adult life, I lived with very, very, very little money. And that was totally fine when I was on my own. And then I met my wife, and then we had kids, and we still had very, very little money. But we'd kind of chosen, we were living without electricity down in the Pyrenees, and people were coming to meditate with us. And I felt, I was very conscious at that time of feeling wealthy. You know, I'd sit outside on the bench in front of the house and look at the trees and listen to the birds and feel like, what a blessing, you know.
Yeah.
We're living in this crappy little rundown shack. With the first shop is 20 miles away. There's no running water. There's no electricity. There's no track to drive in. And feeling, feeling very much a sense of abundance with that.
Yeah.
And clear that, okay, at some point the time came and that wasn't good enough anymore. My children were getting older. They had different kinds of needs. And then, okay, first, I would just adjust my needs. I didn't have much money. I didn't want to spend a lot of energy making money. So I just kept my needs very low and felt prosperous. And then that wasn't the same. And then I had to go in the other direction. Now I'm going to adjust my means and make more effort to make money because I need to do that in a different way now with my kids.
Yeah.
And the sense of kind of feeling a space around it, feeling a sense of prosperity, I think, could be the same in both cases. Whether I was living on, for some years about €5,000 a year as our family income, nothing, to now living in a very different.
And there's a very bodily sense of enough, isn't there? As someone who's been an addict and in long-term recovery, that's a very visceral bodily thing. When there's like, an addiction, they'll say you can never get enough of what you don't need, and it's that feeling of lack in the body and emotionally and spiritually, because it's all one unit, obviously holistically, that they were trying to fill with something. And we see that in kind of consumer culture now in a way that it's almost like, as someone who studied addiction because they had to, the world has caught up, and I'm now looking around and going, oh, now everyone's acting like a fucking junkie. And it was very interesting for me that the sort of 12-step movement is almost stepping away, if you read Russell Brand's book, into just this sense of lack that's sort of free floating now, this sense of not enough. And the money mindfulness exercises you mentioned, there's the bodily dimension of that as well. Like I did the exercise you gave me a few years ago of recording for a month. I recorded what I spent everything on, but I did that exercise on my phone as I was walking around. There's apps for it. But I also noticed in my body how it was when I handed over money, or when I noticed when I took money out of the cash machine, I had this feeling of like I was getting away with something, because it harks back to being a student and being not sure if it would pay out that tenner that I needed for my dinner. And now it's never a problem now, but I still had that feeling in my body, and I remember saying to some of my Russian friends, like, I really enjoy paying for certain things. And culturally, we had a huge conversation about this, because that was just a foreign idea to them. And many of my British friends do, particularly my Russian friends. They were like, they were actually asking me, what do you mean you enjoy paying for it? And I was saying, well, because I, like you were saying, I was buying, I was like, this pair of shoes is fantastic. I could never make this pair of shoes. I'm really going to enjoy this pair of shoes. I really want the person, who made these and the person who sold them to be well compensated. And and of course, they weren't made in a Nike sweatshop or anything, but it was, I really enjoyed buying those shoes. And to my friend at the time, they were like, I can't imagine enjoying giving someone else my money. And that's a strange idea for me as a Buddhist who's been raised with the idea of dana and generosity. But it is tricky running like workshops on a dana basis for people that aren't familiar with the idea, because they'll always pay 20% less than they would if they were forced to. You know what I'm just jamming on this theme here, but as you say, it's awareness of the money, but also the bodily response during those transactions.
Yeah, and that's what you get to track, right? Like I say, if you're spending that time seeing what you're spending money on, but particularly how the attitude towards the moment of payment, and you see that, the distaste or the discomfort. When I first did that practice that I then gave you, of writing down everything I spent for a year, 2 years, did I do it? I think it's a long time ago now, but I had all kinds of views. Like, the idea was really distasteful for me. I had the idea that it's uptight, it's really complicated, it's unnecessary, it means I'm sort of penny pinching, or I'm fixated on every little last detail of money. And all of that, there was a kind of actually hatred, right? It was like a sort of acid bile in my body of like, really, it totally didn't fit with my self-image. My self-image was, I'm very cool and about money, and I don't worry about it too much. And what that really translated as is, I'm really unconscious about money, and I'd rather not think about it.
Yeah, avoidant. It's avoidant.
So when I did start doing that process and writing it down, it wasn't uptight. It wasn't very complicated. Yeah. It was actually really illuminating. And yeah, it was a big part of what transformed my relationship to money.
Yeah.
That, and actually realizing, because I'd worked a lot in the Buddhist frame of dana, right? And there's, again, this sense of, there's something beautiful. Dana means generosity, support, offering. And it's beautiful to be generous and to support each other. But it's often just gets stepped down into one just meaning sort of donation, which is a sort of throwaway version of dana.
A lot of listeners
also, it's often a way...
A lot of, just to inform listeners, a lot of listeners know the Buddhist word dana, meaning generosity, is how much traditional Theravada Buddhism is done. So a monastery, for example, will always be done on donations, and it's many Buddhist teachers will only accept donation-based workshops, which can seem a bit strange and tends to sort of throw people out and make everyone anxious in the modern world. But a lot of those teachers, I think, are basically screwed over by people just paying very small amounts because they can get away with it. So sorry to interrupt you, don't mind. I just wanted the listeners to get the context.
But I would say both sides are complicit. I think, one, it's true. People then give a derisory amount because the associations with donations are like that in our culture. Like if somebody is offering body work or therapy by donation, it's usually because they haven't qualified yet and they're not, and therefore they're not very good, right? Yeah. So it's like we associate donations with basically getting a substandard service. So that's a terrible basis from which to offer people who have got decades of practice and teachings. But there's the unconscious associations with the just give a donation, and the assumption that a donation will always be less than an equivalent commercial.
Yeah. Normally it is.
But I think the teachers are complicit in that system because a lot of people who are teaching on dana are also uncomfortable around money themselves, and so rather than deal with it head on, they, dana, give whatever you like. Even if the teacher's actually struggling to make a living, or even if they end up actually feeling a bit resentful themselves or a bit like unsupported. So that was the other thing that started to change with me, is I realized this isn't working, teaching like this. So I started to really tell my students in a very straightforward way, look, this doesn't work. So I've got a few options, right? I can just stop teaching and go and doing something that's a bit more lucrative because I need to make more money. Or I can start just charging a fee for teachings, and that will create all kinds of waves in the Buddhist world, and has done when I've done things on a fee basis. Or I can at least, and this is where I'll start with you, I said, I can really tell you the amount of support I'm getting isn't enough. And this particularly happened, one of the first times this happened was in Brighton, actually. And I said, look, do you guys, last time I came here, this is how much came in. And it equates to like basically you guys coming and saying to me, you love these teachings, you love these practices, you really appreciate the day. And then you're giving me an amount that's like, what you'd spend on coffee on the way home from the teachings.
Well, I'm not coming back again. Starbucks, and then I've had people turn up to workshops with a croissant and a coffee from Starbucks, and then give me a $5. And I'm thinking, you just fucking spend £5.50 on that,
Right. Feeling I give a huge amount of value to these teachings in my life and these practices in my life, but the actual way that gets enacted out, right, the embodiment of that appreciation gets expressed as you say you value it very much, but what you express is that you value it like you value a cup of coffee on the way home.
Yeah, I always say to people, don't tell me what you value. Show me your bank account and show me your diary, what you spend your time on. Because that's the other big currency when everyone's busy, right? It's how they spend their time. Like maybe they volunteer and help on something and they really invest their time in something. And a lot of these principles translate directly into the kind of sex and love sphere as well. Like when I've done embodied attraction work with people, one of the biggest things is people feeling like they're already attractive. They love themselves enough. That sense of, and many people have had the experience of getting a boyfriend or girlfriend, and then all of a sudden you're massively attracted to everyone else because you're giving off these signals of like, well, I'm doing okay and I've got enough, and this kind of abundance kind of side of things is absolutely. My wife always talked about. We used to teach courses together on this. She'd talk about having to love yourself and that kind of self-love and having an erotic relationship with yourself, and that being kind of just extremely attractive to other people. And there's a sort of unfairness in this almost, and I've seen some of these same principles of feeling enough play out in relationships, love and sexuality, as well as in the financial domain. They seem directly analogous and equivalent.
Yeah. And that's certainly a lot of the way I work with people now in terms of the embodiment part of meditation. It's not just that you're putting your attention into your body. It's not just that you're inhabiting your experience in some sort of neutral way. It's that you're actually kind of like, one could also describe it as you're kind of accompanying yourself. You're hanging out with yourself. You're really entering into your experience with a spirit of kind of interest and gladness, and like you're finding out that it's incredibly interesting and gratifying to be in your own experience. And, that in everyday parlance, we might call that self-love, right? But self-love is also one of a kind of overused term that people might have all kinds of associations with, some helpful, some less helpful. But that sense of like, not just what it's like to inhabit your experience, but what's the attitude you have towards your experience. And we tend to either have a sort of dry, dismissive or attitude. A lot of Buddhist practitioners come to it with a kind of analytical attitude, or a sort of neutral, I will just be with my experience, breath is coming in and breath is going out, etc. Or we have an attitude to our experience where we kind of get into all the drama and detail, and we sort of drown in the drama of it. And the encouragement is to bring an attention that's basically kind and curious. Like, oh, breathing. Oh, this field of sensation. Oh, this kind of miracle of being human and having all this stuff happening. And, as we apply that as a practice consistently, we start to actually kind of rejoice in the very fact of being able to hang out with ourselves, which one could equally describe as, an erotic or a love relationship with oneself. And genuinely, you can't persuade yourself that you're good company, but you can actually find out that it's very gratifying and sort of relieving and pleasant to be with oneself, actually. And of course, that doesn't feel like the case, first of all, because what you first get to be with is your jitteriness and your reactivity and your agitation, and that's not so pleasant to be with. But by applying this kindness and curiosity, that stuff starts to kind of burn up and get revealed and clean itself up.
I just really want to say to any listeners out there that haven't sat for a little while, even a weekend retreat or something, that it's a really lovely thing when you sit down and maybe the first day or two you're just settling. If you're as busy as I am, the mind's running around. And there's that feeling of you rest a little bit and you're good company, good food, good ethics. Your mind's not distracted by, the fact that you just did something dodgy. And then there's that sitting with the self of just being like, oh, I like myself. I like being with myself. This is enough. I'm not having to fix myself or add anything to myself. And I have glimpses of that on a daily basis, meditating now, or just walking in the park near my house, which I do most days. And I just really encourage listeners to give themselves the chance to have that by sitting for a few days at some point, not just doing the mindfulness app for 10 minutes in the morning, which is a sort of, it's better than nothing. It's going to be helpful. It might focus your mind a little bit, relax you, but that few days sometimes is needed, isn't it? But and on the other hand, you've also done these sort of retreats in the city, going back to the engaged sense, because not everyone can do these go away for a week or 10-day Vipassana things. So what was the impetus behind that?
Yeah, that's actually why I'm in London right now, where I'm talking to you from. I'm here doing that this week. And so partly it's true, it's a good support for people who can't go off on retreat, but equally it's just as good a support for people who have done plenty of retreats. But then, just like you were saying, it's beautiful to take that time to really kind of take that immersive dive into inner practices, like in retreat. And you kind of, you're meeting yourself and exploring your experience, but in this quite rarefied environment, which has a great beauty and potency to it, but it doesn't necessarily help with the integration to do it all off in this rarefied environment. Yeah,
the integration part's the missing piece, isn't it, on so many embodied practices and Buddhist practices.
So what I do in these sort of week-long practice intensives in London is the 2 full days of the weekend, which we just did this weekend, Saturday and Sunday, and then we meet in the evenings, Monday through Thursday. So people are kind of, whatever the material is, we kind of like stir it all up and get it going in the Saturday and Sunday. And then Monday through Thursday, people are kind of in the midst of their relationships and their work and their stuff, and then coming back in the evening and checking in. And so they're sort of doing this sort of in and out looping of like exploring the material in a sort of contemplative way in their practice, and then seeing it play out in their life, and then bringing the way they see that playing out in their life back to the practice center in the evening and kind of refining it. And I really enjoy it. It's a very kind of rich way for me to work with people. And I see it's very helpful for that integration. People are maintaining their daily practice, but it's also potentized by, being a sangha, having a community, working together, practicing with other people, getting teachings, having the support of a teacher, and then this sort of back and forth. You're in the midst of your life and you've got a greater than usual amount of support and guidance.
I think it's a beautiful format, man. I was really impressed when I first saw you do that. And I remember my first retreat. I went away 5 days at Guy House, 5 days of metta with Rob Babea. Absolutely loved it. Transcendent states, crying and talking to the flowers by the end of it. By the time I'd got the train home, I was a mess. The next day I'd completely forgotten it. And it was almost worse than not having done it, because it was like a kind of love hangover, And I had, very little integration into my daily life after that retreat. And the same when I've done Zen intensive. So in case people are thinking that their school does it better, I don't think there's a single traditional school that does this well. Some worse than others, and it's I talk about yoga being the same. It's the conflict between the container and the integration. And the container has to be there and be good, because otherwise, you're not practicing, just living. Yeah. So in terms of kind of integrating practice into life, your format, I think, is really innovative. And the other thing is you've been quite innovative in the online world. So back in the day, I got interested in sort of meditating and mindfulness online, and there wasn't much out there at the time. And you were really one of the people leading that charge.
Yeah. The first, after I taught Work, Sex, Money, Dharma a few times live in London and New York and Jerusalem, I think, and I can't remember where else. And, I saw, this is potent stuff. And it was in a way born from that same non-integration experience, right? And you get all these great meditation instructions on retreat for how to attend to different mind states with a lot of precision. And then at the end of the retreat, you get one single instruction for the whole of the rest of your life, which is sort of go forth and be mindful.
Yeah.
And that is a good instruction, but it's a little bit incomplete, right? It's like you need where and how and what do I do when this and that arises. So I put together, it was quite rudimentary in 2011, I think it was the first time I ran that online, and I saw the potency. I'd been working with people on Skype for a couple of years by that, like mentoring individual students. And I had lots of friends and colleagues and other Buddhist teachers which now everybody does it. It seems very ordinary to work online. But people were really quite doubtful at the beginning with the idea that, you have to be in the room with someone. There's all this energetic stuff. The transmission happens, mind to mind. It's like, yeah, but also if awareness doesn't fundamentally have a location, right? Other than it's here, and here is everywhere. Plenty of powerful transmissive stuff can happen through a screen. And of course, it's a second best to being in the room, but it turns out to be a very good second best, whereas the assumption was it would be somehow a very poor second best.
I've also...
And so... So I did that. Oh, sorry, the delay is getting in the way.
Keep interrupting each other. So I did a Purpose Black Belt course 4 years ago. It's the first time I came to you for advice, and we used your platform and kind of worked with you on that. And I was kind of skeptical. I was like, okay, is this going to work? Like embodiment online, is that really going to happen? And the feedback I got, we ran that course twice in Britain, twice in Russia. People want to keep doing it. And I'm like, no, it's not really what I do now, but it's changed lives. There's people still messaging me, I started this business based on this. And people had deep, profound experiences to the point where in the second time we ran it, we had to add in a rest tweak, because we thought, this isn't going to go very deep. And what happens is it was an embodied experience. And after 4 weeks, people were just exploding. People were like, I can't do it anymore. It's too intense. It was the opposite problem than we thought. So the second time we ran it, we had like a week off between weeks 4 and weeks 5. And that really surprised me. And then same with EFC, our big course. We're currently running the first year where the first module is online. And we used to have 5 modules in person. Now we have 2 big ones in person where people can go really deep in residentials, including at your beautiful place. Really nice environments. But the first 8 weeks are on virtual. But we've scheduled it so they have a little practice every morning, 5 little reminders throughout the day, and a little practice every evening, and then once a week, a bit of a bigger chunk, and, you know, a solid couple of evenings a week. And we're actually finding that's working better, because it's like your money, sex, dharma retreats, work, money, sex, dharma retreats. It's spread throughout their actual lives, and it seems to be really impacting people very strongly. So I just want to encourage anyone out there who's kind of looks down upon online training, that it's just not the case, that it's a kind of second best.
Yeah. And, you know, it's interesting. We were talking earlier about monastic life and non, and doing that stuff in the midst of one's life and focusing on integration is actually much closer to monastic practice than going on a retreat is, right? A monastery has room for all of life. Monastery is plenty of things going on. You're living with these people that you wouldn't have chosen to live with, right? And you're being kind of called to account. You're being called to your practice all day long throughout your life. And then we've made up this sort of mini monastic times called retreat. And you go on retreat, but a retreat is nothing like being in a monastery. You're cut off from the rest of your life, and then you're ejected back into the rest of your life. So actually, these things that we're finding, and online's a great support for that, of ways to kind of support people in the midst of. Ironically, in some ways, it's closer to the monastic style of it being a genuinely immersive practice that covers all the areas of your life.
And dude, what is missing for you online? Do you find, like, having just sort of sung the benefits of online training, do you find there's something different? I mean, I find it still has great value to get together in person.
Yeah. Well, you know, I mean, warm bodies, you can't match the intimacy of a warm body in a room, you know. So that's the bit. And on my online courses, we put quite a lot of care into establishing ways people can connect outside of the teaching sessions as a community. So there's a forum and they can share, and we give them exercises and they find buddies and do the exercises, and that's great. But, you know, that's, I'm sure, the same with EFC. When people come to the module, and then especially when they come back a few times to the module, and they get to bond with people in real, you know, space over time. And that's, you know, a lot of people feel isolated. I've lived my whole adult life in community. So I notice it mostly when I'm traveling and teaching. It's like, oh yeah, like being alone. But so many people feel isolated in their lives. So that's the bit that online can't manage so well, is really fostering the sense of community that comes alive when you're actually really hang out with people.
Yeah, I think there's something with the embodiment crowd that they kind of have this slightly specialist interest, and they can really geek out together, but it's not so much cerebral. It's the fact they're eating together, being with people, this shared kind of living. This is why we've made our two big modules, both residential modules, and both in nature. We found those were sort of very powerful pieces to kind of add in as the natural world and the kind of living together, eating together, not just turning up to a place in London, you know, in a room, which we used to do more of. So pros and cons. Some of it on the online is not what people think either, is it? Because it's, for example, when we use breakout rooms on Zoom, where there might be 50 people on the call, but then we put people in little groups of 4, they love it. And it's not that it's online that's the problem, it's they're just being talked at, and that's boring. Whereas when you can go and chat with your friends, and, you know, there's 4 people in a breakout room and you can have a little chat together, they always come back sort of invigorated. And so some of it's not the online context, it's the context of just there isn't any dialogue sometimes. I like to keep things very embodied and interactive online. Like on Zoom, I'll see 50 people and I'll have them waving and standing up and sitting down and moving their hands to indicate things. So it's a very visceral, movement-based experience, and fun and playful and interactive, even though there's a computer in the way.
Right. Oh, nice. Yeah.
Okay, so we're running a bit short on time here. So in terms of other things to talk about, there was one thing on your email that I absolutely have to ask you about, which is the Buddha's assistance on attention in the yoni. What does that mean?
So, you know, it's interesting. Probably listeners aren't familiar with the term yoni, or if they are familiar with it, it's the Sanskrit word. It's usually translated as vagina, right? So, and it's used a lot in the tantric world or yoga world sometimes. And it's very interesting that it's also translated as womb. And when the Buddha talks about giving attention, right, and about grounding your attention in your body, there's a very specific term he uses. And I know you don't like the foreign jargon, but I would back up a little bit. The term is yoni so manasikara. So yoni so means literally from the womb, mani, mind, sikara, kara, action. So he talks about how most attention is disembodied, right? And the attention that we're giving to experience in a meditative training is yoni-so. So the word he uses for embodied attention is attention that comes from the womb. And so maybe the men are starting to feel left out, right? But actually that sense of the womb being a kind of, well, what's the womb? It's the origin of life, right, in many ways. And it's also that sense of like the deepest place within us. And I found that really helpful, that sense of just the imagery of letting your attention be grounded down in your womb, like the sense of the kind of the depths of your belly. And whether, even if you're doing concentration practice, actually, that grounding your attention down sort of below your navel in the deepest place in your belly as a way to kind of, the way the belly center sort of activates embodied presence. It's not that all that you're feeling in your body is happening down there in your energetic womb, let's say, but the sense of by learning to wake up that area, by infusing that area with attention and awareness and focusing there, it tends to have an enlivening effect on the whole of bodily experience. It tends to generate sensitivity to bodily experience. It tends to make bodily experience come alive in all kinds of different ways. It's really helpful for noticing when you're tense or agitated or activated in certain ways. And it also seems to be the center of the way we can learn to progressively relax in ways that conventionally we can barely imagine. Most people, tense, and then you think of relaxation just as a muscular process. But really, muscular relaxation is kind of the first layer of relaxation in some ways. And that yoni-so, that sort of womb-born kind of embodied attention is really helpful. And certainly, when people are using breath as a meditation object, there's all kinds of ways to attend to breathing. And one of the traditional ways is to notice the air entering and leaving the nostrils. But most of us tend to be quite kind of busy anyway. We're sort of overactivated in our thinking mind and head center. And just to train grounding your attention down in that sort of deep womby place in your lower belly it seems to me very, very helpful and particularly appropriate for who we are culturally, right? Most of this audience with a Western education, a strongly intellectually based cognitive education, and getting to be able to drop your attention down deeper inside your visceral experience.
That's lovely. If someone has never had a womb, I still feel like there's a sort of powerful kind of visual. We've all been in one, and right. That sort of powerful visceral image of a sense of that's kind of still there. So,
and my sense is, and you attend in that, you'll discover that you do have a womb in some way, not biologically, but Buddha was talking to all kinds of people, but most of the people he was hanging out with were men, actually. Right. So it's very interesting that he used this term.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by the fact that he would use that. I know there's the sort of yoni shakti, and there's a whole kind of womb yoga thing. We had Julia Davis on talking about that. I just want to point listeners to a few other podcasts as we wrap up. So if you like the stuff on kind of the householder path versus monastic, then look at Miles Kessler, one of the early podcasters. He is a meditator and Aikido teacher who spent a lot of time on retreat, and then now is a sort of family man, the business owner. That podcast may be interesting to people. There's another popular podcast by Vince Cullen on Buddhism and addiction, if people like that piece. There's the stuff on money was our Canadian Fire Rhythms teacher. His name eludes me. So he was the only other one on money that we looked at. And in terms of the sex one, there's plenty of good conversations in here about kind of sexuality and gender in a kind of mindful way. So that's just for listeners. And if people want to find out more about you, Martin, where do they go?
They can look at my website, martinaylward.com, or mindfulnesstraininginstitute.com, or just Google my name, and there's plenty of stuff there.
Great. And a final message about the body for listeners.
Maybe body is infinite. Maybe, like Buddha says, The whole universe arises and passes right here in this body. And so if we leave aside the idea of body, the image of body, the sense of body, physical body-shaped existence, and come in and down, in and down, in and down. And if you do that consistently and sincerely and steadily, experience can open up in unimaginably liberating ways.
Beautiful. Thank you very much.
All right. Thanks, Mark. Nice to talk to you.
If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe to get more. If you'd like to help us build the Embodied Tribe, leave a review on iTunes or share this on your social media. If you're interested in training globally, sign up to receive the newsletter at embodiedfacilitator.com. Until next time, welcome home to the body.